She said, her voice calm but firm. "It's no problem at all." The janitor, still flustered, looked at her uncertainly but stepped back, allowing Lisa to continue her task. Her movements, though slowed by the pregnancy, were deliberate and efficient as she carefully gathered the papers, making sure none were lost or damaged. The act was simple, but it spoke volumes. The few people who had been paying attention to the scene in the waiting area began to take notice. Lisa wasn't someone to just stand by and let things slide, even when it was inconvenient for her. She was a woman of action, one who refused to sit back when there was something that needed to be done. As she finished, she straightened up, her back slightly aching but her sense of satisfaction palpable. She handed the last few documents to the janitor, who now looked relieved. "Thank you so much," he said, gratitude in his voice. Lisa smiled at him, wiping her hands on her skirt. "No problem," she said before walking back to her seat. Her mind, however, was still on her sister Kimberly and the trial. Kimberly didn't deserve to be facing this, not after everything she had been through, and Lisa wasn't about to let the judge, or anyone, treat her sister unfairly. As the courtroom doors opened, a hush fell over the waiting area. Lisa stood up, adjusting her bag over her shoulder and placing one hand protectively over her belly. It was time to face the judge. Inside the courtroom, the judge, an older man with a reputation for being strict, sat at the bench, flipping through his notes. His cold, indifferent gaze swept over the room as if he were already bored with the proceedings. Kimberly sat nervously beside her lawyer, her fingers tapping against the armrest. Lisa walked into the courtroom just as the judge's gavel slammed down. "Next case," the judge called out in a gruff voice. Kimberly's name was called, and Lisa's heart tightened. She had to hold it together, for her sister, for the family. She wouldn't let this judge treat Kimberly like a criminal when she hadn't done anything wrong. As the judge gave his instructions, Lisa couldn't help but feel a surge of anger rising within her. But she stayed calm, watching every movement, every word the judge spoke, all the while waiting for the moment to act. But just as the judge was about to pass judgment, the courtroom doors slammed open. Everyone turned to see a tall, authoritative figure stride in, the U.S. Senator, Lisa's brother-in-law, and Kimberly's husband. His presence was commanding, and the room fell silent. The senator, without hesitation, walked straight to the bench and addressed the judge, his voice steady and controlled, but filled with undeniable authority. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe you may be overlooking a few key details here." The judge looked up, his face now pale as he recognized the senator. The tension in the room thickened, and everyone could sense that something monumental was about to happen. The senator's next words were nothing short of a bombshell. "This case is being reviewed at the highest level. And as for the behavior of this courtroom today, well, let's just say I don't think you'll want to proceed any further." The room went silent, every eye now on the judge, who seemed to shrink under the senator's gaze. The atmosphere was electric. Lisa couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and relief wash over her. This was the moment. This was the change she had hoped for. The judge stammered, trying to regain his composure, but it was too late. The senator had made his presence felt, and the entire room knew the power dynamics had shifted. The judge reluctantly called for a recess, and Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As the crowd slowly dispersed, whispers filled the air, but Lisa's focus remained on her sister, who was looking at her with wide eyes. "Thank you," Kimberly whispered, her voice full of emotion. Lisa nodded, a quiet smile forming on her lips. "We're family," she said simply. "We take care of each other." And in that moment, as the senator stood by their side, it was clear that the balance of power had been shifted, not by money or influence, but by a commitment to doing what was right. Herself back up, the effort sending a sharp jolt through her body. The room held its breath, waiting for her next move, but Lisa remained silent, focused. Every muscle in her body screamed, but she gritted her teeth and continued. The second push-up was no easier, but this time she felt a surge of something stronger than the physical pain. Determination. She wouldn't back down. Not now. Not when it felt like the entire courtroom was holding its collective breath, waiting for her to falter. Lisa pushed through, each movement slow and deliberate, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the discomfort. It was as though she could feel the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. This was about more than just completing an exercise. It was about standing up for herself, for her sister, for every person who had ever been belittled by the system. With each push-up, she reminded herself of all the battles she'd fought, against inequality, against injustice, and now against this man who thought he could break her spirit. Her breath was ragged now, the strain on her body intensifying, but she wasn't done yet. Hoffman watched, his expression impassive, but the flicker of something in his eyes told a different story. He wasn't prepared for this. Lisa wasn't crumbling under his pressure. She wasn't showing weakness. She was showing strength, strength he hadn't expected from a pregnant woman. The room, once silent, now buzzed with quiet murmurs as the people in the courtroom began to realize what was happening. Kimberly, her eyes wide with disbelief and admiration, watched her sister with a mix of fear and awe. She could see the toll it was taking on Lisa, but she also saw the resolve in her eyes. This wasn't just about surviving the moment. It was about showing that no one could humiliate her without consequences. When Lisa finally managed the last push-up, her arms gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The entire room seemed to exhale in unison, a collective release of tension. But Lisa didn't stay on the floor. She pushed herself up onto her knees, steadying herself with one hand on the ground, and looked directly at Judge Hoffman. "I've done what you asked," she said, her voice raw but steady. "Now, let's get back to the matter at hand. My sister is innocent, and I won't let you turn this into a spectacle." The courtroom fell into stunned silence, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, a figure stepped forward. A man in a suit, standing tall and confident, entered the room. It was her husband, Senator David Matthews, and he didn't hesitate for a second. "Your Honor," he said, his voice booming with authority, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about the way this courtroom is being run. This treatment of my wife and the blatant abuse of your position will not be tolerated." Hoffman's eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The senator's presence was undeniable, his influence clear. Lisa felt a wave of relief wash over her as her husband's words sank in. This was no longer just about a judge and a pregnant woman. It was about power, about standing up to those who thought they could abuse their position. The tension in the room shifted. The whispers grew louder, but they were no longer whispers of judgment. They were whispers of disbelief, of realization that things had changed. Judge Hoffman, who had thought he could assert his authority with cruelty and arrogance, now found himself on the defensive. "Judge Hoffman," the senator continued, "I think it's time you reconsidered your approach. We'll be filing a formal complaint, and I assure you, this will not go unnoticed." Lisa, still shaky but filled with a quiet strength, stood up slowly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She exchanged a look with her sister, who now stood beside her, their bond stronger than ever. And for the first time since entering the courthouse, Lisa felt a sense of victory. Judge Hoffman, clearly rattled, had no choice but to call a recess. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the once oppressive atmosphere now tinged with something new, hope. Lisa had done more than survive the ordeal. She had shown everyone that even in the face of injustice, strength could prevail. As the room emptied, the senator walked over to Lisa, his arm gently wrapping around her shoulders. "You did it," he said, his voice full of pride. "You showed him." Lisa nodded, her heart still racing but her spirit unbroken. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, her eyes meeting her sister's. "We did it together." And as they walked out of the courthouse, Lisa knew that this moment, this stand against the abuse of power, was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but with her family by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. He continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. "This is an abuse of power, and I won't stand by and let it happen to my wife or anyone else." Judge Hoffman opened his mouth to respond, but Robert's glare silenced him immediately. The entire courtroom was now on edge, every eye fixed on the senator as he stood in front of Lisa, who was still shaky but now supported by her husband's firm grip. "You humiliated her," Robert said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "And now you'll answer for it. You may wear the robe, but you do not wear the mantle of justice. I'll make sure the world knows what you did here today." The room was dead silent. Lisa, still breathing heavily, could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom, but now it was different. Instead of judgment, there was awe and a quiet sense of solidarity. Anthony Davis, the young attorney who had been quietly recording the entire exchange, now stood beside them, his phone still in hand, his eyes filled with conviction. "Robert," Lisa whispered, her voice weak but full of emotion, "I'm okay." "I know," he said, his hand gently rubbing her back. "You've been more than okay. And now, it's time we made sure this never happens again." Judge Hoffman's face was flushed with anger, but his position of power was rapidly slipping away. Robert Carter's influence and his unwavering confidence were undeniable, and Hoffman was now standing on shaky ground. "You want to talk about equality, Hoffman?" Robert continued, his voice rising. "Let's talk about how the law is supposed to work. You are here to serve the people, not to belittle them or abuse your power. This is over." With a sharp motion, he turned to Anthony, who had been quietly standing by, waiting for a moment to speak. Anthony nodded and immediately pulled out his phone, his thumb quickly flying across the screen. "I've got all the evidence we need," Anthony said, his voice carrying the weight of determination. "We're taking this to court, and we're going public." Robert looked down at his wife, his expression softening just for a moment. "You're stronger than anyone in this room, Lisa," he said, "and I'm proud of you. This isn't over, not by a long shot. We'll make sure the world knows what happened here today." As the senator stood by Lisa's side, his aura commanding the respect of everyone in the room, Judge Hoffman finally realized that he had lost control. The power dynamic had shifted, and the facade of his authority was crumbling before him. "You're done," Robert said, his voice final. "We'll be pursuing legal action, and trust me, you'll be hearing from us soon." Without another word, he helped Lisa to her feet, and they turned to leave. The courtroom doors swung open as the group moved toward the exit, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, Lisa felt the tension in her body begin to lift. Robert's steady hand on her back was a constant reassurance, and though the battle wasn't over, it felt like they had won a victory that was long overdue. The story of what had transpired in that courtroom would soon spread across the news. And in the end, it wasn't just about a pregnant woman forced to the ground. It was about standing up against injustice, standing up for what's right, and showing the world that power, when abused, will always meet its match. The fight had just begun, but for Lisa, her sister, and her family, they knew that together they would ensure that no one would ever have to endure such cruelty again. "Board," one of Robert's aides said, his voice unwavering. "You're being investigated for misconduct, Judge Hoffman. Your actions today will not go unpunished." The room fell into an even deeper silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The reporters, who had been snapping pictures and recording the scene, now turned their focus entirely on Hoffman. His eyes darted between Robert, Lisa, and the crowd, realizing that everything he had tried to hold on to, his power, his reputation, was unraveling before him. Hoffman's face turned an unhealthy shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His hands trembled as he clutched the gavel, but it was clear that his authority had already been stripped away. The gavel was nothing but a hollow symbol of his former power. Robert turned to Lisa, his voice low but firm. "We're done here," he said, his hand still on her back, offering her a sense of calm in the midst of the storm. Lisa nodded, her heart still racing, but a sense of relief beginning to wash over her. As they made their way toward the exit, the applause continued, echoing through the courthouse. The crowd was on their side now, united by their shared outrage over Hoffman's actions. It wasn't just about Lisa anymore. It was about standing up to abuse of power, standing up for the rights of the vulnerable, and demanding accountability from those in positions of authority. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city streets. Lisa took a deep breath, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she stepped out into the world, knowing that today, something important had changed. The fight was far from over, but this was a significant step forward, and as Robert walked beside her, his phone still buzzing with calls from his colleagues and media outlets, they both knew one thing for sure: they had made a difference. This wasn't just about one judge's fall from grace. It was a wake-up call for the entire system. They had taken a stand for dignity, for justice, and for every person who had ever been silenced or belittled in the face of power. Today, the system had been reminded that no one, no matter how powerful, was above accountability. The fight for justice wasn't over, but today they had won. As the final whispers of the courtroom began to settle, Robert and Lisa remained at the heart of the storm. The weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air, palpable and powerful. The reporters were still gathering footage, capturing the final moments of Judge Hoffman's downfall, but for Lisa, everything felt different now. The room had emptied, but the echoes of applause still reverberated in her mind. The energy, the unity, the force of standing up for what was right, it was something she'd never forget. This was bigger than her, bigger than Kimberly's case. It was about a systemic change, a shift in how those in power were held accountable. Robert turned to her, his expression softening as he guided her out of the courthouse. The reporters who had gathered were still snapping pictures, but they weren't just capturing the end of a legal battle. They were documenting the beginning of a movement. Lisa was no longer just a woman fighting for her sister. She had become a symbol for every person who had been trampled by the very system meant to protect them. The world was watching now, and Lisa knew, deep in her bones, that the fight for justice wasn't over. But with Robert by her side, with the support of the community, and with the courage that had carried her through this day, she was ready for whatever came next. Together, they would make sure no one would ever be silenced again.